never thought I would be the woman who destroyed her own marriage. But the night I looked into my 23-year-old nephew's eyes and felt something I hadn't felt in years. I knew my life was about to split into a before and an after. My name is Melissa Harper. I'm 42 years old, and until last summer, I believed I had a good life. Not perfect. Not like the couples you see on Instagram, smiling on beaches with filtered sunsets, but stable, respectable, predictable. I've been married to Daniel Harper for 18 years. He's 45, solid, reliable, the kind of man who wakes up at 6 a.m. every weekday without an alarm, the kind who pays bills early, mows the lawn in straight lines, and believes that problems are solved by working harder, not talking longer. We live in a quiet suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, the kind of neighborhood where the mailboxes match and people wave but don't really look at each other. We have a 2-story house with beige siding, white shutters, and a porch swing I picked out during our fixer-upper phase 10 years ago. From the outside, we looked like we had everything figured out. But somewhere along the way, our marriage stopped feeling alive. There was no betrayal, no screaming matches, no dramatic breakdowns, just silence. The slow kind, the kind that creeps in between conversations and settles there like dust. Daniel works in logistics management, long hours, endless phone calls. Even when he's home, he's half somewhere else, scrolling through emails, checking shipment updates, watching financial news with the volume just loud enough to avoid conversation. We used to talk about dreams. Now we talk about groceries. I don't blame him entirely. Life happens. People change. Routine settles in like concrete. And I changed too. I used to be spontaneous. I used to paint. I once drove 3 hours just to see a meteor shower because I didn't want to miss it. Now I schedule dentist appointments and compare detergent prices. At some point, I became efficient instead of alive. Sometimes I'd sit at the kitchen island after dinner, staring at the reflection of myself in the dark window. I didn't recognize the woman looking back. She looked fine, healthy, maintained, but her eyes were tired. Not physically tired, emotionally. I didn't feel wanted anymore, not in the obvious way. Daniel would still kiss my forehead before leaving for work, still squeeze my shoulder in passing, but it felt automatic. Muscle memory, not desire. And I missed being desired. That's the part no one tells you about long marriages. It's not the fights that scare you. It's the indifference. Sometimes I wondered if this was just adulthood. Maybe passion is a temporary chemical reaction, and comfort is the real goal. Maybe this is what maturity looks like. Or maybe I was just lonely in a house with another person. I tried to talk to Daniel once. "Do you ever feel like we're just roommates?" I asked one night while he was half watching television. He muted the volume and looked confused. "Where is this coming from?" "I don't know. I just feel like something's missing." He sighed, not angrily, just tired. "Mel, this is what stability looks like. We're good. There's no drama. Isn't that what people want?" I nodded, because he wasn't wrong. We were good. But I didn't feel good, and that difference became louder every day. I started going to the gym more often, buying slightly nicer clothes, doing my hair even when I had nowhere to go. I told myself it was self-care, reinvention, a healthy midlife reset. But deep down, I think I was waiting to feel something again, waiting to be seen. If you had asked me back then whether I would ever risk my marriage, I would have laughed. I would have said I'm not that woman. I'm not reckless. I'm not selfish. I'm not destructive. I believed that. I truly did. Until the summer Daniel's nephew came to stay with us, and everything I thought I knew about myself began to unravel. It started with small things. Daniel came home earlier than expected one Tuesday evening. I was in the kitchen, folding laundry, trying to look casual while Ethan was upstairs on his laptop. I froze the second I heard the door click behind him. "Melissa, are you folding towels again?" he asked, setting his briefcase down. His tone was light, but his eyes lingered just a second too long on me. Something in the way he looked made my stomach tighten. "Yes," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just keeping up with chores." He nodded, but something had changed. The casual ease that usually filled the room felt thinner, fragile, like glass stretched too far. Over the next few days, I noticed subtle shifts in Daniel's behavior. He began asking where I was going more often, even for small errands. His questions weren't angry, they were calm but deliberate. "Are you heading to the store now? Do you want me to pick up anything?" He watched me more closely, observing my movements with a kind of quiet calculation I hadn't seen in years. I tried to convince myself it was coincidence. He had always been a detail-oriented man. Maybe he was just more attentive because of work stress. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. One afternoon, I was in the living room reading a book when Daniel walked past me to grab a glass of water. He lingered near the kitchen counter, pretending to be busy. I could feel his eyes on me. "Melissa," he said casually, "have you been spending a lot of time with Ethan lately?" My heart stuttered. I dropped the page I was reading and looked at him. "What do you mean?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, even though panic was rising in my chest. "I don't know," he said slowly, studying me like he was trying to read a map drawn on my face. You seem close." I swallowed hard. "He's family," I said, almost too quickly. "He's just staying with us for the summer. We talk, that's all." Daniel nodded, but the tension didn't leave the room. His gaze lingered, sharp and assessing. That night I lay awake, listening to the quiet hum of the house. Ethan's laughter from his room had always been comforting, but now it made my chest tighten with guilt. From that point on, I became careful. I avoided lingering in hallways when Daniel was nearby. I pretended to be busy whenever Ethan and I were alone. Every glance, every touch had to be calculated, rehearsed. The thrill that once came from secrecy now carried the weight of fear. But fear doesn't stop desire. It never does. One evening, Ethan and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen while Daniel was out running errands. We made small talk, pretending to talk about homework and career plans. But the air between us was taut, electric, like a stretched rubber band threatening to snap. I could feel him watching me, studying the curve of my shoulders, the way I laughed at his jokes, the slight quiver in my voice. "Melissa," he said softly, "you look tense." "I'm fine," I lied. My words sounded hollow even to me. He stepped closer. Not too close, but close enough that I could feel his warmth through the thin fabric of my shirt. "You're lying," he said. And I was. Later that night, Daniel confronted me for the first time. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He just asked questions, careful and calm, like a surgeon testing the boundaries of his patient's pain. "Melissa," he said, his voice low, "have you been spending time with Ethan alone?" My chest tightened so much, I thought I might pass out. I wanted to tell the truth, to admit everything, to relieve this pressure building in my chest, but fear and shame held my tongue. "No," I whispered. He didn't argue. He just nodded slowly, his eyes unreadable. And that, perhaps, was the cruelest part. The silence that carried more accusation than words ever could. From that day, the house became a delicate balance of observation, pretense, and paranoia. Every step I took, every laugh I gave, had to be measured. Daniel was watching. Ethan was watching. And I was watching myself, trapped in a web I had spun too quickly to escape. I realized then that living a double life wasn't just dangerous. It was suffocating. The thrill of secrecy had begun to fade, replaced by the constant, gnawing fear of discovery. Yet, despite it all, I couldn't bring myself to stop. Desire, guilt, fear, and shame intertwined, making it impossible to untangle the truth from the lie. And I knew that sooner or later, something had to give. After that night, nothing was the same, but at the same time, everything looked exactly the same from the outside. I kept cooking dinner. I kept smiling at Daniel when he talked about his work. I kept pretending that my life was normal. Only now, there was a second life hidden inside the first one. Ethan and I didn't talk about what happened immediately. The morning after, we avoided each other for almost an hour, moving through the house like two people trying not to collide. Then, when Daniel went to shower, Ethan caught my hand in the hallway. He didn't say anything. He just squeezed it once. Not too tight, not too soft. Like a secret signal. And I didn't pull away. The relationship that developed after that was built on silence more than conversation. We never discussed labels. It was not love in the way movies show it. There were no declarations, no promises whispered in darkness. It was something more fragile and more selfish. We met in small, stolen moments. A touch while passing in the hallway. A hand on my back for 2 seconds when Daniel was in another room. A look that meant more than words ever could. But living like this slowly poisoned my mind. I started analyzing everything. If Daniel asked me where I was going, I felt panic even if I was just going to the grocery store. If Ethan didn't smile when I entered the room, I wondered if I had done something wrong. I became hyper-aware of doors, footsteps, phone notifications. I kept checking whether Daniel might suddenly walk into a room without warning. Paranoia became a constant companion. At night, when Daniel slept beside me, I would lie very still, afraid that my breathing might sound guilty. Sometimes I felt disgusted with myself. I was cheating on the man who had given me stability for nearly 2 decades. But I also felt alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. That contradiction was tearing me apart from the inside. Ethan was different from Daniel in ways that scared me. He was emotional, impulsive sometimes, passionate in small bursts. One afternoon he told me he thought about leaving the city and trying to work in digital marketing somewhere warmer. "Would you leave?" I asked without thinking. He looked at me for a long time. "Would you want me to?" I didn't answer, because the truth was complicated. Part of me wanted him close. Another part of me was terrified of what our relationship was becoming. We never talked about the future. That was our unspoken rule, because talking about the future would force us to decide what this was, and I wasn't ready to choose. The worst part was the guilt. It followed me like a shadow. I looked at Daniel sometimes while he was watching television or reading documents and wondered how much he would be destroyed if he knew. I imagined telling him the truth, the anger, the shock, the sadness in his eyes. Daniel was not a violent man, but I knew betrayal would hurt him in a way that no argument ever had. One night, while lying in bed, I almost told him. The words were right there in my throat. But then I thought about 18 years of marriage, about our history, about everything we built, and fear won. I told myself that I would stop, that it was just a mistake, but I was already too deep inside a life I didn't know how to escape from. It happened on a Friday night. The house was unusually quiet. Daniel was still at work, finishing some report he said was urgent. Ethan was in his room upstairs, probably watching something on his laptop. I was standing in the kitchen again, holding a glass of red wine I didn't really want to drink. Loneliness has a strange weight when it lives inside your own house. The air felt different that evening. Not tense, not dramatic, just waiting. At around 9, I heard footsteps behind me. "I thought Uncle Dan was home," Ethan said. I turned slowly. He was wearing dark sweatpants and a white t-shirt, his hair slightly messy as if he had been lying on his bed. "He's working late?" I said. He nodded and walked to the refrigerator, opening it even though he wasn't hungry. We didn't speak for a few seconds. Outside, the streetlight was reflecting off the wet pavement from earlier rain. The kitchen window looked like a frame for something I couldn't understand. "You're drinking wine alone again," he said quietly. It wasn't judgmental, just observant. "I had a long week," I replied. He leaned against the counter, close enough that I could smell the faint citrus scent of his shampoo. "Do you want company?" The question wasn't innocent. I knew that. And he knew that I knew. But I didn't say no. So he poured himself a glass of water and sat across from me at the kitchen island. We talked about nothing for a while. About his job search, about my exercise routine, about how summer nights in Ohio feel heavier than winter sometimes because expectations float in the air. At some point, I finished my wine, and then the silence came again. It was the kind of silence where you can hear your own heartbeat if you focus hard enough. "I think about you sometimes," he said suddenly. My fingers tightened around the empty glass. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I think about how sad you look when you think nobody is watching." The words hit somewhere deep and painful. "I'm not sad," I said automatically. He shook his head slightly. "You are. You just don't let people see it." I wanted to argue. Instead, I said, "You shouldn't think about me like that." "Why not?" Because it felt dangerous. Because it felt intimate in a way that was already crossing invisible lines. Because part of me wanted him to keep thinking about me like that. I didn't answer. He stood up slowly and walked around the island until he was standing next to me. Too close. Not touching, but close enough that the space between us felt electric. "Melissa," he said softly. When he said my name like that, something inside my chest tightened painfully. I should have told him to go upstairs. I should have reminded him that I was his uncle's wife. I should have created distance. But I didn't. Instead, I looked up at him. And that was the moment everything changed. He leaned down first, very slowly, as if giving me time to stop him. I didn't move. I don't know if I made a conscious decision in that moment. It felt more like surrender than choice. His lips touched mine. Not aggressively, not passionately at first, just uncertain, testing the boundary like someone touching fire to see if it burns. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he might hear it. After a second, I pulled him closer. That was the point of no return. The world outside continued existing. Cars passing somewhere in the distance, a dog barking, the refrigerator humming quietly. But inside the kitchen, time felt suspended. I knew what I was doing was wrong. The thought was there, loud and clear. But another voice whispered that I had spent too long being lonely. We didn't speak after that, because words felt unnecessary and dangerous. I knew that night would change everything. I just didn't know how fast the destruction would start. I kept telling myself that nothing was happening. Nothing was allowed to happen. Ethan was 23, my husband's nephew, someone who should have felt like a son to me in a way. The thought of crossing that line should have filled me with disgust or fear. Instead, it filled me with anxiety and curiosity. I hated myself a little for that. The conversations between us became longer without us noticing it. One night turned into 2, then 3. I found excuses to stay in the kitchen after dinner. He would sit at the table with his phone in his hand, but not really looking at it, like he was waiting. Or maybe I was the one waiting. We talked about movies he watched in college, about how society pressures young people to choose careers too early, about loneliness in big cities. Sometimes he made jokes about how serious I was. "You think too much?" he told me once. "Someone has to," I answered. He smiled in a way that made my chest feel tight. One evening in late June, Daniel went out to meet a coworker. Ethan and I were alone in the house. It was raining outside. Not a storm, just slow summer rain tapping against the windows. I was making tea even though I wasn't thirsty. It was one of those pointless activities people do when they don't know what else to do with their hands. "Do you believe people can love more than one person at the same time?" he asked suddenly. The question startled me so much that I almost dropped the cup. "What kind of question is that?" "A serious one." I turned to face him. He was leaning against the counter, watching me. "I think people can feel many things at once," I said carefully. "But love is different." "How?" I paused. "Because love is a choice." He didn't respond immediately. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere far away. "Do you still love Uncle Dan?" he asked. The question should have offended me. It didn't. I thought about it longer than I should have. "Yes," I said finally. "I do." It was true. I wasn't lying. But it wasn't the whole truth. Because loving someone doesn't mean you feel alive with them. There was a silence after that. Not uncomfortable exactly, but heavy. Like words were waiting behind our teeth. Then he said something that changed everything. "I think you're lonely, Melissa." He said it gently, not like an accusation, more like an observation he was afraid might hurt me. And it hurt anyway, because it was true. I didn't answer. I just looked at the rain outside and tried to breathe normally. He walked closer, not fast, not aggressively, slowly, like someone approaching a wild animal. "You don't have to pretend around me," he said quietly. When he said that, something inside me cracked, because I had spent years pretending. Before I could stop myself, I said, "What do you want from me, Ethan?" My voice sounded smaller than I expected. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he lifted his hand and stopped just before touching my hair, like he was asking permission without words. That moment stretched longer than it should have. Then he lowered his hand. "I don't want to hurt you," he said. But he didn't walk away, and I didn't ask him to. That was the first night I admitted to myself that I was scared of what I was feeling, not because it was wrong, but because it was starting to feel inevitable. Ethan arrived on a humid Sunday afternoon in June. I remember the heat most of all. The air felt thick, heavy against my skin, like something waiting to happen. Daniel had mentioned weeks earlier that his sister's son needed a place to stay for a while. Fresh out of college, communications degree, no job yet. "Just until he figures things out," Daniel said casually over dinner, as if inviting someone to borrow a lawnmower. I didn't hesitate. Of course he could stay. We had the space. The guest room had barely been used in years. I expected awkward small talk and the quiet presence of someone who mostly kept to himself. I didn't expect Ethan. He stepped out of his car, wearing a faded gray t-shirt and jeans, his hair slightly too long, curling at the edges like he hadn't decided whether he was growing it out or just avoiding a haircut. He smiled when he saw us. Not polite, not forced, just open. Easy. "Aunt Melissa?" he said, pulling me into a quick hug. It caught me off guard. He smelled like sunscreen and laundry detergent. Clean. Young. "You've grown up," I said, immediately hating how cliché that sounded. He laughed. "That's what everyone keeps saying." Daniel clapped him on the back, already talking about traffic and job prospects. I watched them carry his boxes inside, 2 duffel bags and a single cardboard box labeled books. I told myself the flutter in my chest was nothing. Just nostalgia, just time moving too fast. That first week was normal. Ethan was respectful, almost overly so. He called Daniel Uncle Dan, asked before using anything in the kitchen, and insisted on helping with dishes. But he talked to me, not the way Daniel did. He asked questions, real ones. "What did you want to do before you got married?" The question startled me. We were sitting at the kitchen table late one evening, Daniel already asleep upstairs. "I don't know," I said carefully. "I wanted to paint. Maybe open a small studio someday." "Why didn't you?" I gave the answer I'd given myself for years. "Life happened." He studied me in a way that made my pulse shift slightly off rhythm. "That's not really an answer," he said quietly. It had been a long time since anyone challenged me like that. After that, we started talking more. Nothing inappropriate, just conversations that stretched past midnight, about music, about mistakes, about how lost your 20s can feel, about how confusing your 40s can be. He told me he felt behind compared to his friends. I told him everyone feels that way at some point. Sometimes Daniel would walk into the room and find us laughing about something trivial. He didn't seem bothered. Why would he be? We were family. That word became a shield. Family. I started noticing small things. The way Ethan listened without interrupting. The way his eyes lingered when I spoke, as if what I said mattered. The way he smiled when I walked into a room. It had been years since I'd felt that kind of attention, and attention is dangerous when you've been starving for it. One afternoon, I was reaching for a bowl on the top shelf of the pantry when he stepped behind me. "Here," he said, his arm brushing lightly against mine as he grabbed it. It was barely a touch. Accidental. But my breath caught. I stepped aside too quickly, knocking a bag of rice onto the floor. He laughed softly and crouched to help me pick it up. For a second, we were too close. My heart was pounding in a way that felt inappropriate, irrational. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. That night, I lay awake longer than usual. I told myself it was harmless, that attraction is just biology, that thoughts aren't actions, that I was allowed to feel something as long as I never crossed a line. I repeated that like a promise. But I also started choosing my clothes more carefully when I knew he'd be home. I started noticing when Daniel worked late. And the house didn't feel as quiet anymore. It felt charged, like static before a storm. I still remember the day everything fell apart. It didn't happen with screaming. It didn't happen with dramatic confrontation or sudden violence. It happened quietly, in a way that felt even more terrifying. It was late September when the truth finally came out. The summer had ended, but the secret had not. That morning felt ordinary at first. Daniel left for work earlier than usual, saying he had a meeting he couldn't miss. He kissed my forehead before leaving, the same way he had done for years. The gesture should have felt comforting, but instead it felt heavy, like a goodbye he didn't know he was saying. Ethan was downstairs when I came into the kitchen. He looked nervous. I noticed it immediately. His fingers were tapping lightly against the counter, a habit he had when he was anxious. He wasn't looking directly at me. "What's wrong?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he said, "I think Uncle Dan knows." The words hit me like cold water. My heart started beating so loudly I could hear it in my ears. "What do you mean?" I asked, even though I already felt the truth crawling up my spine. "He asked me if I had feelings for you." I felt my stomach drop. "What did you say?" I didn't answer. The silence that followed was unbearable. I sat down slowly on one of the kitchen chairs because my legs suddenly felt weak. "He's been watching us," Ethan said quietly. "For a while now, I think." My mind started racing. Memories flashed through my thoughts, the way Daniel had asked questions, the way his gaze had changed, the long silences. I felt stupid, blind, naive. I asked, almost whispering, "What are we going to do?" Ethan looked at me for a long time. Then he said something I was not prepared to hear. "I think you should tell him the truth." Fear rose inside me immediately. "No," I said quickly. "It will destroy everything." He shook his head slightly. "It's already destroying everything." Tears filled my eyes without permission. "I love him too," I said. "I don't want to hurt him." "Then stop lying," Ethan replied gently. I didn't answer, because part of me knew he was right. That afternoon, Daniel came home earlier than usual again. But this time, the atmosphere was different. He closed the front door slowly, deliberately, without speaking. Then he walked into the living room where I was sitting. Ethan was upstairs. Daniel stood in front of me for almost a minute before saying anything. "Melissa," he said finally, very calmly, "I want you to tell me the truth." My hands started shaking. "About what?" I asked. He took a slow breath. "About you and Ethan." The world seemed to stop. I felt like every sound in the house had disappeared except the pounding of my heart. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to keep protecting the fragile life I had built. But looking into Daniel's eyes, I saw something that terrified me more than anger. I saw deep, quiet pain. So I told him. Not everything, not the details, but enough. The room was silent for a long time after I finished speaking. Daniel didn't yell. He didn't move. Then he said, "How long?" I whispered, "Since summer." He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, I saw exhaustion, sadness, and something broken inside him. "Why?" he asked. I tried to explain loneliness. I tried to explain how I felt invisible sometimes. I tried to say I didn't plan for it to happen. But the words sounded pathetic even to me. Daniel listened without interrupting. When I finished, he spoke very quietly. "You didn't just betray me," he said. "You betrayed the life we built together." His voice didn't rise. That calmness hurt more than anger would have. Then he said something that still echoes inside my head. "I don't hate you, Melissa, but I don't know how to stay married to someone I don't trust anymore." That night, Ethan left the house. He packed his things in silence. I stood near the window watching him put his bags into a taxi. He didn't turn back to look at me, and I didn't run after him. The following weeks were filled with legal discussions, long conversations that felt like negotiations rather than emotional exchanges. Daniel moved to stay with his brother temporarily. The house became unbearably empty. Eventually, divorce papers were filed. When everything was finished, I sat alone in the kitchen where the first kiss had happened. I thought about the life I had destroyed. I thought about love, loneliness, and the terrible price of choosing desire over stability. I realized something painful, but honest. Sometimes people don't choose evil deliberately. Sometimes they simply choose what makes the emptiness inside them quieter for a little while. But silence is not the same as healing. And in the end, I lost both the man who loved me for 18 years and the boy who thought I was his escape. I don't know if I deserve forgiveness. I only know that some mistakes are not loud explosions. Some are slow, beautiful, and devastating in the way they grow inside your life before you notice they are already killing everything you once believed in.